Welcome back to the Chicagolandians, a casual Chicago sports podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Cunningham, joined by my co-host, Connor Cunningham.
We're two brothers from the Chicagoland area talking about the latest and greatest in Chicago sports news.
Welcome back to another episode of the Chicagolandians. I'm your host, Patrick Cunningham, joined as always by Connor Cunningham.
Hello.
We are very excited for this episode. We are kind of paying a little bit of an homage to the history of Cunningham sports. This is a shout out to our dad, who is the biggest fan of the mystery player that we're going to be talking about in today's episode.
One of the biggest fans that I didn't know there were as big of fans as my dad.
And should we reveal this mystery player?
I think it's in the episode description and in the title, so I think we can.
In today's episode, we're going to be talking about famed basketball player, businessman, actor,
Sex icon,
Wilt Chamberlain. Famous basketball player who played for the 76ers and the Lakers and has a huge place in our dad's heart. And also has a huge place in NBA history, NBA lore. He's got some of, as we'll find later, some of the most redonkulous stats in the history of the NBA. Whether you're talking minutes per game, scoring, rebounding, shots blocked before they even counted shots blocked. Obviously, it's a 100-point game. The stories that you can tell of Wilt Chamberlain, endless.
His career is mythical. Every day you can find a new story or retelling of the strength and athleticism of Wilt Chamberlain, some pickup basketball game that happened in the random streets of Philadelphia where Wilt was dunking it from the half-court line. The legend that is Wilt Chamberlain is endless, and learning a little bit more about him these past couple days has really been a fun time.
Absolutely. Wilt also played for the Warriors. Forgot to mention that too. But, yeah, super excited to talk about it. We're going to be covering his career in the NBA as well as some things he did after his career in the NBA. He only lived to be about 62. Kind of crazy to think what he could have done if he lived, 20 more years till be 80, 90 nowadays. He could have made his return to the NBA. Maybe could have slept with 50,000.
40,000 women. Yeah, 50,000.
Yeah, but we will get into that later. But first up, for some Chicago sports headlines, the first thing that we have is Jalen Johnson, corner for the Chicago Bears, was snubbed from first-team All-Pro and was instead named to second-team All-Pro. Now, Connor, I got to ask you about what the difference is between the All-Pros, first-team, second teams, compared to, just being a Pro Bowl player. What's the criteria? How does the criteria differ?
AP All-Pro is selected by the media, but just the media, whereas the Pro Bowl includes a third of its voting from fans as well as coaches and the media. So in general, it's considered to be more prestigious being an All-Pro just because it's more selective. If you think about it, there's maybe only one or two quarterbacks who are selected on the All-Pro team, whereas for Pro Bowlers, there's maybe six, 3 from each division. So there's more people who are selected to first-to Pro Bowlers than All-Pro.
Gotcha. Do you know who the first-team All-Pro corners were for the NFC?
Yeah, so for the defense, for the All-Pro, so for one thing, it's not regulated to divisions. It's just an All-Pro team. So the first team was Pat Surtain, Derek Stingley. Those are the two ones. And then slot cornerbacks was Marlon Humphrey. And then safeties were Kirby Joseph, former Illini, Xavier McKinney. So if you just look at that, if there's technically 3 cornerbacks who are selected to the team, it's a competitive list, and Jalen Johnson was not included.
Kirby Joseph was first-team All-Pro. Wow,
yeah.
Shout out Kirby.
Notably didn't make the Pro Bowl, though.
Really? Okay, so I was going to ask, does that ever happen if fans don't really know about a player, but, the reporters of players have more respect for a guy? Oh, that's so interesting. Well, Jalen, Chicago fans know how good Jalen is. It's definitely hard to rate a team. Derek Stingley and Pat Surtain, both playoff teams. Definitely hard to give credit to a player on a 4-win team, but the curse of being on the Bears plagues Jalen Johnson once again. Next piece of news we have is the Bears' search for head coaching candidates. We have continued to interview multiple candidates.
Have certainly continued.
We
continued.
are trying our best to interview as many candidates as we can. Connor has been working diligently, keeping an active list and tracker of all of our head coaching interviews. January 8th, we hired Mike Vrabel. At the time
Interviewed.
of this,
We did not hire.
we did not.
I really wish we hired Mike Vrabel, but we interviewed him.
Unfortunately, at the time, so that happened January 8th. It is now January 13th, and Mike Vrabel was hired, I believe, yesterday, January 12th, to be the new Patriots head coach. Vrabel was a former linebacker for the Patriots. They like doing those internal or historic hires, but still literally takes probably the 1A or 1B candidate off the table before the season's even over. Gets you real nervous, gets you panicked about the Bears running out of all the options before we've even finished interviewing all of our jabroni candidates.
Yeah, a couple others. Ron Rivera interviewed yesterday, and Thomas Brown interviewed today. So a couple more candidates to add to the list that we have. Also in news, Mike McCarthy, who the Cowboys and Jerry Jones declined the Bears interview request to talk to Mike McCarthy. Then 5 days later, the Cowboys and Mike McCarthy part ways. So for one, there is now a 6th head coaching spot that is open with the Cowboys, and also a hot new candidate who's on the block in Mike McCarthy. Now, my piece on Mike McCarthy, I think that a lot of stuff has been wrong with the Cowboys for a while, and to put it all at the feet of Dak Prescott or Mike McCarthy isn't fair, but I think Mike McCarthy, from a eagle-eyed view, has an impressive offensive resume. The Cowboys, save from this year, have been able to have solid offensive production no matter the offensive coordinator, even when Kellen Moore left. He also is a coach who has head coaching experience. He won a Super Bowl. And I think a lot of Bears fans, if you look through Twitter, the common consensus is that you want a head coach with experience who's offensive-minded. And Mike McCarthy is somebody who answers or ticks off those boxes. Now, are there issues with Mike McCarthy? I think so. They didn't have a lot of playoff wins, a lot of playoff success with the Cowboys. There's a reason he's being released from the team, but I think there is a visceral reaction from a lot of Bears fans about the idea of Mike McCarthy, and I think maybe it might not be that bad having Mike McCarthy as an option.
It is still taking me a while to get over the initial idea of Mike McCarthy. I think maybe I have some deep-rooted Packers hate still for the guy, or maybe it's because I feel like Rodgers had a falling out with McCarthy, and that made me look down upon him, or whenever the Cowboys struggle, people point to McCarthy. So I guess I'm kind of feeding off of all of that energy. But if you look at the other candidates other than McCarthy, like if we don't get Ben Johnson, I think Aaron Glenn would be the next up that I would want. After that list, I don't really want any of these other guys.
Maybe Kingsbury.
Yeah, Kingsbury. But like Drew Pensing, Anthony Weaver, Mike Kafka, I don't want any
those
of
are
those.
fake candidates.
Yeah, I don't want any of those guys. And if you're telling me the next guy is Mike McCarthy, who has won a Super Bowl and has had very, very good offenses. I mean, the Cowboys last year were freaking unbelievable, right? And maybe that's the guy that can come in and work well with Caleb. Because if we're going to take a shot with an offensive coordinator, somebody that isn't a head coach, it better be Ben Johnson or like nobody else. I would still obviously rather have Ben Johnson, but Mike McCarthy seems like a safer option.
I agree. It does feel like a lot of fans are always saying, with Vrabel, the appeal was that he had head coaching experience. He's a guy who brings in culture. I don't know a lot about Mike McCarthy's culture, but it seemed like common consensus was that Caleb needs somebody to come in, or we need somebody to come in who has experience. We can't waste somebody who doesn't know what they're doing. And, of course, we need an offensive mind to help develop Caleb. That candidate comes along, and then we're like, well, not that guy. That's not what we were talking about, But I guess we'll see. Mike McCarthy is not my number one candidate, but I think he is better than some of the candidates that are currently available.
Sadly, we'll have to wait and see, probably till the end of the Super Bowl, to see who the Bears end up hiring. Next piece of news, we have The Bulls just lost to the Sacramento Kings, 124 to 119. Not much notable from this game except Zach LaVine, as usual, had 36 points. Pat Williams.
Read that out.
He had 8 points.
Okay. Was he the second highest scorer, or why did you include him there?
I'll say I haven't been following the Bulls super close, but I just still remember the day we drafted Pat Williams, and I was confused.
It was a stumper.
I was confused that day, and every single season since I've been confused what this guy's deal is. I guess he's a defensive guy, but you just look at his stats, and he stinks. It's not all about points, as we'll see later, but
It's a lot about points, though.
but that's what wins you the games. And Pat Williams has a tough time scoring those points. So I don't know what we're doing. Bulls dropped to 18-21. So I remember last episode I said I don't think we could ever drop below 5 games below 500. We're kind of flirting with that right now. We're kind of making
3 games under.
Yeah. But at this pace, I don't see any way we get within Cooper flag range.
I mean, the season's halfway over. We would have to lose almost all of our games from here on out to get into that range.
Yeah. Seems like we're going to have a tough time getting Cooper flag to save this season, to save this Bulls team. So I guess we'll be kind of destined to be this for a while.
I mean, the Hornets, Raptors, and Wizards have 8 wins, and 6 wins. And then in the West, I'm looking at the Pelicans, who have 8 wins. So we would have to really slow our roll on getting the number 1 pick there, unless the NBA could rig another lottery and give the Bulls a number 1 pick. Unfortunately, Cooper Flag is not a Chicago native like Derrick Rose, so I don't think it'll happen, though.
Yeah, so not much news in the Bulls world. Next piece of news we have: Illinois just lost to USC after a dominating win against Penn State, where we beat them by, I think, at least 20, 30 points. We followed that up with a 10-point loss to unranked USC. We dropped to 12-4. Our current rankings as of today, we're number 13, I believe. What do you think we'll drop to? Probably outside 20, maybe around 20.
I feel like you couldn't get too punished having probably your best player or one of your best players out. That would be a pretty harsh drop to go out of 20.
Yeah.
Maybe 18, maybe, I would say.
It's definitely different with basketball compared to football, right? Because you just have so many more games. But yeah, as Connor said, we are also down Kasparis, who is our point guard, our Eastern European point guard, number 32, who is supposed to be I saw recently a top 5 draft pick in the NBA. So he is the
continued takeover of Europe in the NBA.
But we were able to beat Penn State pretty handily without the offensive firepower of Kasparis. So that made you think, okay, maybe we can continue without this guy. But this game really proved that we need Kasparis back as soon as possible. Brad said he's kind of a day-to-day or game-time decision every time, so hopefully he can come back to help this team out.
We're not going to run the table in college basketball. Losses happen. Playing in the Big Ten is tough, even if USC is a new addition. But losing games to unranked teams is never fun, so it's a tough loss.
Connor, do you want to hit this next piece of news?
Yeah, sure. So Illinois football coming hot off the Citrus Bowl win versus the South Carolina Gamecocks. This was a big bowl win for the program, and hot off the Citrus Bowl win, the citrus is still hot. It's still warm. The Illini have gotten good news, getting some prominent players to return to the roster. So the big name is Xavier Scott, who was a first-team All-Big Ten player, I believe the only first-team All-Big Ten player on Illinois, as well as Cade Yakis and then offensive lineman J.C. Davis. This is also big with Luke Altmaier saying that he will return to the team as well. So there are 18 starters from the Citrus Bowl who are going to be returning. 16 official starters are going to be returning from last year. So we definitely are running back a large majority of this team from last year. We're going to lose Pat Bryant to the draft, and Zachary Franklin has finally ran out of eligibility. But the message is that this team that we had of rising momentum is going to continue to have forward momentum. It's not like our 2 years ago when I feel like all of our prominent players with both of the Browns and Witherspoon just left and Martin all left at once. I still feel like we're retaining a lot of talent, and looking to next year, I feel like we could definitely be a team that is at least talked about in the playoff conversation. I'm excited for next year.
Man, we should definitely make an episode on the rise of Illinois football, because this is definitely the best position the team has been in definitely certainly a decade, maybe 20 years, I think. What this program has done in the last couple of years has really been remarkable and exciting to see. Just talking about being in the playoff conversations next year is pretty remarkable.
Yeah, exciting time for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. That's going to segue us into our next section. We're going to try out a new little segment this week. We're going to be doing a review of the week, where we're going to read a review of the Chicagolandians podcast. So if you guys would like to have your review read out loud and hear us say your name over the internet waves, why not leave us a review? Connor, do you want to read this review?
All right, yeah, so first review of the segment. This is coming from Not Connor Cunningham. The title is, Wow, What a Show. The Chicagolandians podcast will stave off the bird flu. I never thought meatballs could be so funny, yet intelligent. I might add that they sound very handsome based on their voices. Central casting, these guys. If JJ Redick can get a head coaching job for Mind the Game, then I can only expect future partial or full ownership of the Bears for these two. 5 stars. So thank you for whoever sent in that review. That was a very nice review that you had. If you're interested in being featured on this segment, why not leave a review on Apple Podcast or Spotify, wherever you consume podcast.
It's pretty interesting. It's pretty exciting to see kind of the impact of this podcast and the growth that it's seen, that somebody with a name like that would actually be motivated to leave us a review for our podcast. And such a glowing review is really
ecstatic review for sure.
I mean, that was just positively raving, positively glowing. Central casting. I mean, it was very funny.
That's what I'm saying.
It's very good.
Exciting to see. Exciting to get our first review.
We're going to be moving on to our next working title segment, where we're going to be calling back to an old sports story that we had from the MLB World Series, where, if you guys remember, the New York Yankees faced off against the Los Angeles Dodgers. And at a game in New York, a Yankees player hit a foul ball that Mookie Betts went up to go grasp with his glove, and 2 gabagool New Yorkians, heroes, some might say,
the Pastrami Patrol.
Yes, the Pastrami Patrol. As Mookie caught the ball, they grabbed his hand, keeping him in the stands, and literally opened up his glove and took the ball out. And the faces on the one guy especially who actually took the ball out is just pure bliss.
Nothing but joy.
There's not much going on in that guy's head. He just sees ball. And he's doing something for his city. And I feel like initially the reception of these guys was praise. They said, "You come into New York, we're gonna defend our team."
They said, "This is our zone. This is our area. You can't come into here."
Yes. But unfortunately, as of today, the MLB has officially banned these 2 individuals from all MLB games and anything MLB affiliated
Indefinitely.
So I think that's kind of soft.
Yeah, it's pretty soft.
That's pretty lame.
A sad, cold, and bleak conclusion to one of the heartwarming stories of the summer. It's just sad to see the world mistreat heroes the way that they do.
But moving on, that's going to lead into the main segment of this.
We got a lot of segments here.
Trying out a lot of things with this episode, but this is going to lead us to our main meat and potatoes of this podcast, which is Wilt the Stilt,
the Big Dipper
Chamberlain, the Big Dipper, Wilt Chamberlain. And we're going to start covering the whole Wilt Chamberlain person, who he is. No better place to start. His life before the NBA, his early life, his high school years, and a little bit of his college years, and his pro ball before the NBA. We're going to cover all of that. I'm going to hand it to you, Connor, to talk about his life before the NBA.
Yeah, so let's talk about the Stilt pre-NBA. So early life, before he got into high school, Wilt Chamberlain was born in Philadelphia to a family of 9 children. His first love was not actually basketball. He said that basketball was for sissies, and instead he was very into track and field. By the time he was 10 years old, he was 6 feet tall, And given his size and the popularity of basketball in Philadelphia, he decided to pick up the sport in 7th grade. Between 7th grade and entering his freshman year of high school, Wilt Chamberlain had grown to be 6'11".
As a freshman in high school, he was 6'11"?
Yes. I believe I was 5'8" maybe entering my freshman year of high school. Tall guy. So he was 6'11" when we entered high school, and what came first for him was being a natural track athlete. In high school, he had a high jump of 6 foot 6 inches. He could run a 400-meter dash in 49 seconds, an 800-meter dash in 1 minute and 58 seconds, and could throw a shot put 53 feet. Also with a long jump of 22 feet, which I thought was the least impressive stat, or maybe the most achievable stat. Pat Cunningham, host on the podcast, who is well below 6'11". Pat, you want to talk about it?
So me, Patrick Cunningham, who is just over 6 feet, 160 pounds of lean, mean muscle, I jumped 20 feet in high school. So for someone that is a foot taller than me and the best athlete, one of the best athletes in the world, for him to only jump 22 feet,
Certainly interesting.
seems achievable. I don't want to make Wilt comparisons to myself, but I'll just,
You'll let that sit there.
I'll just kind of let that hang out there. But yeah, that's going to be a theme throughout this episode. Not my relationship, not comparisons to Wilt Chamberlain. If they want to make those comparisons, it's okay.
Let him talk.
Yeah, but what stands out with Wilt Chamberlain is his freak athleticism. And when we talk about later about how he would do nowadays, the thing that sets him apart is his athleticism and his nimbleness and coordination, despite being 7 feet tall.
So continuing on, in high school, this is really when Chamberlain began his basketball career. He started playing in 7th grade, but he really started to come onto the scene when he entered high school. So he went to Overbrook High School from 1953 to 1955. Throughout high school, he averaged 37.4 points per game, which is quite an impressive feat.
It's pretty good.
In 1953, he played West Catholic High School for the city championship. A notable fact was that Chamberlain was quadruple teamed during this game, and unfortunately his team lost 54-42, but Chamberlain still scored 29 points. It's funny to think about a team putting 4 players on one guy, but Wilt Chamberlain was that much of an enforcer that kind of attention was needed. In 1954, so his next season, when I believe he was a sophomore in high school, he scored 71 points in a game. During the summer, the NCAA's most outstanding player, B.H. Bourne, who is a standout player for the University of Kansas, played Wilt the Stilt in one-on-one basketball. Wilt Chamberlain won the game 25-10, and Bourne, who, remind you, had won the most valuable player in college basketball, quit basketball and became a tractor driver, with his quote being, "If there were high school kids that good, I figured I wasn't going to make it to the pros."
I mean, are you telling me B.H. Bourne, there was nobody in his corner, no coaches, no players, no agents telling him,
Hey, BH, man.
there's other guy. This guy's kind of a one-of-one person. That is insane.
Yeah. So that was 1954. Chamberlain really starting to come onto the scene. He's about 15, 16, 17, being known around the Philadelphia and New York area as a prominent basketball player. A little or lesser known fact about Wilt Chamberlain was when he was 16 and 17, he was interested in playing semi-professional basketball, but he was unable to play under the name of Wilt Chamberlain. He still wanted to maintain his amateur status as an athlete, so this caused him to create the pseudonym for himself known as George Marcus in order to play semi-professional basketball for when he was 16 years old for the Pittsburgh Raiders, and 17 he played for the Quakertown Fays. This was found through a series of newspaper clippings from a Reddit post where you would look at the newspaper clippings and see a photo of clearly a young Wilt Chamberlain labeled as this man named George Marcus. But looking at some of the stat lines from this, you think, think that might be Wilt Chamberlain. When he was 17 for the Quakertown Fays, he averaged 40.5 points per game in 9 regular season games. Through the 6 playoff games, he averaged 74 points per game. 74 points per game he averaged, which equates out to almost a 54 points per game in 15 total games, and won the MVP in that league, all when he was 17 years old. Now, granted, he was 6'11", so he was a very physically imposing player even at a young age, but the league still did include some prominent players, including one future Harlem Globetrotter that he would play with. But throughout all of this, Wilt Chamberlain, knowing that he is an incredible athlete, certainly received a lot of attention from college programs. The remark is that he received something around 200 scholarship offers from different colleges, which is an absurd amount. I wonder what the recruiting process looked like for a player of his stature at that age. But Chamberlain was mostly interested in getting away from the East Coast. He was not interested in playing in the West and thought that the level of play outside, more towards the South, was lower. So that kind of brought him to the Midwest, more specifically to Kansas University, KU. Notably, the person who recruited him was his head coach named Phog Allen. We'll talk about Phog a little bit more. But at Kansas, Wilt Chamberlain was an exceptional basketball athlete and continued his track career. In the 100-meter dash, he ran a time of 10.9 seconds, threw the shot put 56 feet, a triple jump of 50-plus feet, and was a Big 8 champion 3 straight years in the high jump, all while wearing a flat cap. If you don't know what a flat cap is, just think of somebody in Peaky Blinders wearing one of those little flat caps. He would wear that in every competition that he would have. You can look up the videos of him triple jumping or the photos of him triple jumping. He's got this silly little hat on.
What's funny about the high jump, for those unaware of some track knowledge, the way modern high jumpers jump over the bar was not the way that people used to jump over. What you see now where people go back over the bar with their back facing the bar is what's called Fillsbury flop.
Yeah, Fowlsburg,
I believe
Fowlsburg
flop or something, which was a innovative technique that one guy just showed up and started doing one time and has now become the norm for high jumping. But before when everyone was still trying to figure out how to high jump, people would just run up to the bar and jump straight over it, essentially like you are staring down at the ground rather than looking up. So when you look at these videos of Wilt Chamberlain jumping, it is almost comical to see him jumping. It's so unusual, especially when you know what high jump looks like nowadays. And it just seems so hard to jump like that. So still incredibly impressive what he was able to do.
Exceptional track athlete. Compared to a gazelle, you can imagine him being a gazelle, being 7 feet tall, running very fast times. So moving on to his career at Kansas as a basketball player, as we talked about, Phog Allen was the coach who recruited Chamberlain to play at Kansas. He retired at the age of 70, and his successor named was Dick Harp, also a funny name. He was his successor, and Chamberlain notably did not really get along with Harp, and it was believed that if Harp was the one who was recruiting him, he probably wouldn't have gone to Kansas in the first place. In 1956, similar to rule changes that would come in the NBA, there were a number of rule changes that came to NCAA basketball, I think in combination to Wilt and also Bill Russell, who I believe was on San Francisco. I think he was on San Francisco Dons, I believe. A series of rule changes came to the league, including free throw shooters having to keep both their feet behind during a free throw because Wilt would just take a few steps back from the free throw line, run up and dunk the basketball. They banned inbound passes from being passed directly over the backboard because teams would just pass it, lob it to Wilt Chamberlain. Offensive goaltending was introduced. If you look at old footage of Wilt Chamberlain playing, a common remark that you'll have is saying, "Isn't that goaltending?" And it was goaltending. It just wasn't a rule yet. And the lane was expanded from, I believe, 6 to 12 feet. But Wilt Chamberlain didn't play his first year, so his sophomore season was his first year as a varsity player for Kansas. One notable thing about his sophomore season was, I think when Kansas was 13-1, they went to go play Oklahoma State. And the last 3.5 minutes for Oklahoma State, they just held the ball and did not give the ball back to Kansas. The clock ran out and the game ended. So this marked a theme for how teams would play Chamberlain. There was no shot clock in college there, so there was no incentive to really score. But this kind of marked a frustration that Chamberlain had with college basketball. He felt like he wasn't being played fairly and the level of play was not what he was looking for. That season, they would be national runner-ups to North Carolina. Wilt still won the Final Four MVP of this tournament, something that's very funny for a player not on the championship roster to win the MVP. But again, North Carolina became famous for running out the clock against Chamberlain. Again, outlining this theme of how teams would play Chamberlain. After 2 full seasons, he would leave Kansas in interest in playing professional basketball with frustrations of college basketball. Another note, he was president of his pledge class for Kappa Alpha Psi, something that is listed on his Wikipedia page, which I thought was very funny. Moving on, after his junior year at Kansas, Wilt Chamberlain, who was not yet NBA eligible because NBA players needed to wait until their corresponding college graduate class had graduated, so Chamberlain went and played for the Harlem Globetrotters. At the time, he signed a lucrative contract for the Globetrotters. Numbers fluctuate between 50 and 65,000, but I believe this was the largest professional contract in sports, was given to Wilt Chamberlain playing for the Harlem Globetrotters, a performance basketball team, not a real basketball team. But his career was something that Chamberlain took a lot of pride in. He really enjoyed playing for the Globetrotters because he was less of a spectacle. He wasn't this big giant that was just depended on to set records and score points, but instead he was relied on to entertain crowds. Some fun stories included a 1959 trip to the Soviet Union, where one notable story was Wilt performing an act with the Globetrotters captain Meadowlark Lehman. He threw him into the air and caught him like a doll, as the story goes, and Lehman was 210 pounds, an incredible feat of strength. Throughout his career, he would join the Globetrotters in the offseason, and in March 9th of 2000, the Globetrotters would actually retire his famous number 13 jersey. Another stat, so this is in 1959, so this is the year before he goes pro. Wilt Chamberlain would play in the annual New York versus Philadelphia tournament, where Philadelphia would come down and bring a team for semi-pro. I believe it was high school and then semi-pro and then professional basketball. They would play tournaments just in essentially playgrounds or caged-in basketball courts. There was a story that I saw of one man. He said this was the most impressive feat of basketball that he ever watched. He went to this tournament and watched Chamberlain play. At the time, there was no alternating possessions for jump balls, so whenever a jump ball would occur, they would just go to the nearest circle and tip the ball up. There was one jump ball that happened in the first quarter of one of these games where Chamberlain, who was 7'1", got tied up with a much shorter player listed at 6'1". They did a jump ball at the free throw line, and while the ball was in the air, Chamberlain jumped up and tipped the ball into the basket without touching the ground, which is illegal in the NBA now, but was an incredible feat of control and mastery for basketball that Chamberlain performed. And not 10 minutes later, the game got rained out and thundered out, as the reporter noted, as if God had seen enough and said nothing better can happen on this day. The game was rained out. But that kind of marks Wilt Chamberlain's career as a non-professional basketball player, and we can start now to get into his NBA career.
So moving on from Wilt's pre-NBA career, we start to move into his actual NBA career, which is really where the whole legend of Wilt Chamberlain starts to be not born. It was already born, but this is where all of the stories you hear about Wilt really start to take place. So just as a general overview for Wilt Chamberlain's NBA career, he started playing in 1959, played till 1973. Across those years, he won 2 NBA championships, which is going to be another point of contention that'll probably come up later. Is a common theme throughout Wilt's career was that he was a fantastic individual player, but that might have come at the cost of his team's ability to actually win, as we talk about other players at his time, like obviously Bill Russell and eventually Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Discredited what he was able to do because he was unable to win the big game. But he also won 4 MVPs and held the scoring title, meaning he scored the most points in the league, for 7 years. He had 13 All-Star seasons, and notably, he was the only center in NBA history to ever lead the league in assists, which is remarkable to say the least. There was a period in his life after his first 7 seasons in the NBA where he decided to stop taking a ton of shots. He decreased his volume from about 30 shots a game to, I believe, 13, and decided to see how many assists he could get, and actually led the league in assists, which is something you have literally never seen before and something that has never happened again in the NBA.
I believe somebody just challenged Wilt and said, there's no way. Essentially, it was like, hey, there's no way you could get that many assists, Wilt. And he said, look at me. And then that season, he led the NBA in assists, he led the NBA in rebounds, and he was third in points scored. No player has ever gotten that close to leading in all 3 statistical categories in the NBA. That was an incredible season from Wilt Chamberlain.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're not going to go through every single year of Wilt's career. There's a lot of patterns. Every year he's pretty dominant, but I think it's important to point out his first rookie year. So he was drafted by the Philadelphia Warriors, and in his rookie year, he was, Philadelphia Warriors before they moved to San Francisco and eventually became the Golden State Warriors. They were the Philadelphia Warriors. So his rookie year, first year in the league, Wilt averaged 37.6 points per game, which led the league, and led the league in rebounding with 27 rebounds per game. That's going to be another thing that comes up later. The most impressive stat of Wilt's career is, I think, his rebounding stats, more so than his scoring. It's his rebounding, which is something I don't think we'll ever see again in NBA history. So he averaged 27 rebounds per game and won, as a rookie, the MVP, obviously Rookie of the Year, in the same year. So literally, the first year Wilt comes into the NBA, he already proves himself to be the most dominant player on the court.
Only 2 rookies have ever won that award. That is Wilt Chamberlain and Wes Unseld in 1968, 1969.
Wow. As I said before, we're not going to go through each year by year, but we're going to look at his career as a whole and break down each specific part of his game. And literally any aspect of his game that you look at, he's setting records at. So we're going to look...
Except one.
Yeah.
Free throws.
Yes,
very
true,
poor free throws.
True. So we're going to look at his career through the lens of his records. And the first thing that I don't think a lot of people talk about, when you talk about Wilt Chamberlain, you always hear about the scoring, that 100-point game. Something people don't realize is just how many minutes per game this guy played every single season. And is another thing that when you try to think about how Wilt would play in today's era, something that just doesn't really even compute. Wilt, over his entire career, averaged 45.8 minutes per game. And for context, a regulation NBA game is only 48 minutes long. And today, most NBA players it is remarkable if a player gets 40 minutes in a single game. For context, Allen Iverson's the most recent player to eclipse 40 minutes per game, and all the other leaders in minutes per game all played in this Wilt Chamberlain era. So to play 45 minutes per game is really absurd. And in his third year in the NBA, Wilt actually averaged 48.5 minutes per game.
Pat, you said NBA games are 48 minutes long, though, right?
Right. 48 minutes long. So how the heck did he average 48.5 minutes per game? Well, I'll tell you. Wilt, in this season, sat out a total, over every game in the season, he sat out a total of 8 minutes the entire season. And that was, I believe, in his last game, he played 40 minutes. Not by his choice did he go out. He was actually ejected from the game for fighting, which seemed a little out of character for Wilt Chamberlain. He was kind of known for being a gentle giant, a pleasant figure on the court. But for the rest of the season, he played all 48 minutes and had several overtime games that bumped his minutes per game up to past 48.5. And I think of any record, 48.5 minutes per game, I think that's just about untouchable. We're never going to see that again, especially with how the game has evolved nowadays. The depth of benches on NBA teams is much, much deeper. We have way more statistics about load management, how much better people perform when you give them rest. And over an 82-game season, I don't think there's any way you're going to see you're going to see a player get that many minutes per game again.
Yeah, DeMar DeRozan in 2023-2024, he played the most minutes of anybody, and he averaged 37.8 minutes per game, and that's the most in the NBA. With load management right now, it's pretty impossible. It is funny to say, with the qualification of how much more we've learned about sports and data, that load management has become a thing, as if in the 60s, they didn't realize that if a player rested more, he might play better in the future. But
I was reading an article about one of the coaches for Wilt, and they were talking about this revolutionary idea he had where 2 minutes left in the first quarter, he would take out Wilt, and then after 2 minutes in the second quarter, he would put Wilt back in, and how much better he would perform. So it seemed almost as if these guys were discovering the benefits of
rest.
resting your players. Pretty unbelievable.
Wilt Chamberlain, notably, would also only drink 7-Up and Sprite during these games. So he was fueled by pretty much just soda throughout his entire career. Another funny note was he was very worried about people trying to poison him, that he would always have his trainer drink the 7-Up before him, because to make sure that he wouldn't die from the 7-Up/Sprite that he was drinking.
If Wilt Chamberlain ever went into politics, that would be a weakness for him, something that spies and operatives could target. But yeah, when you look at Wilt Chamberlain's many, many records, I think the thing that makes most of them untouchable is just the minutes per game he took. NBA players nowadays have become very, very efficient in their play style. You know, Russell Westbrook in his MVP season was able to average a triple-double without averaging over 40 minutes per game. Players have been able to make much more use out of every single possession, where, as we'll talk about later, this era of basketball that Wilt played in was about as inefficient as you could get.
Very inefficient.
Very inefficient, which kind of leads to a lot of the stats that we'll see. But the amount, the conditioning that this guy had, unbelievable.
All right, so moving on. The guy, an absolute machine, could never take him off the court. Drinking 7-Up, he could play for hours. But what most people associate with Wilt Chamberlain is the man's ability to put the ball through the hoop, his scoring. So Wilt Chamberlain currently holds the record for points per game in a single season with 50.4. I say currently holds the record, but he holds the record, and I doubt that record will ever be broken. In fact, the top 4 points per game records in NBA history are all held by Wilt Chamberlain. Michael Jordan is 5th all-time in points per game with 37.09 points per game. If you look at maybe a single stretch of games or maybe a handful of games, there actually hasn't been a player not named Wilt Chamberlain to average 50 points per game for more than a 5-game span. In 2005-2006, Kobe had a 4-game stretch, which concluded in his 81-point game, where he averaged 50.1. He also had a 5-game stretch in the 2006-2007 season, where he averaged almost 54 points. Elgin Baylor in the 60s had a 5-game stretch of 50.4, and prime James Harden in 2018-2019 averaged 52 for a 5-game stretch, but this record is legitimately untouchable. The amount of shots and the amount of time that this guy would be on the court, the amount of points that he could put up was truly remarkable. He also holds the NBA record for single season points with 4,029 points. For reference, in 2024, Luka Doncic was the scoring champ with 2,370 points, which is about 1,600 points away from Wilt Chamberlain. The man could score the basketball.
1,700 points in a single season is averaging 20 points per game, which is a fantastic season as an NBA player. And that's the difference between Luka, the highest scorer last year, and Wilt Chamberlain in his best year.
Unreal.
Pretty remarkable.
Yeah. Wilt Chamberlain, incredible scorer. The next biggest part of his game is undoubtedly his ability to rebound. In Wilt's second year in the NBA, as Pat mentioned before, he averaged 27.2 boards per game. That record still stands today. For reference, Domantas Sabonis was the rebound champ in 2024 with 13.7 rebounds per game. Throughout his career, he's an 11-time rebounding champ, and he holds the record for most rebounds in NBA history with almost 2,400. Bill Russell is second with a little over 2,100 rebounds, 21,000 rebounds, and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is third with almost 18,000 rebounds. So a funny thing that you'll notice is that the two highest rebounding record holders are from the same era. Wilt Chamberlain undoubtedly was one of the greatest rebounders of all time. He owns the top 7 single-season rebounding stats as well, and in one game against the Bill Russell-led Celtics, he had 55 rebounds. The Rockets currently lead the NBA in rebounds per game with, I believe, 58 rebounds per game. So that would be like if the Rockets had one guy rebounding the entire game.
The next part of Wilt's game that we're going to be talking about is his ability as a defender. Obviously, a guy of Wilt's freakish athleticism, somebody that has supposedly a 50-inch vertical, someone that's 7 feet tall, he's going to block that ball a lot. What's kind of hard about this stat is at the time Wilt played in the NBA, for some reason they didn't consider blocked shots as a worthy stat of keeping track. So there's not a ton of documentation about how many shots per game Wilt was actually blocking. However, towards the end of his career, they did start to track data for blocked shots. So as of now, we have 112 games of shot block data for Wilt Chamberlain. In those 112 games, he averaged 8.8 blocks per game, which is absurd. For context, Rudy Gobert, who won the 2024 Defensive Player of the Year, averaged 2.1 blocks per game. There are so many iconic stories and clips of Wilt Chamberlain, of him grabbing three-pointers out of the air, just being an absolute monster blocking shots. And then the last stat that we're going to hit on with Wilt Chamberlain is another thing that you don't hear people talking about a lot, was his ability to not foul people. Wilt played in 1,045 games. Across all of those games, Connor, how many games do you think he fouled out?
I mean, maybe 50?
Yeah, maybe like 50. Like Shaq in his whole career fouled out about like 60 times, right? A big man like that. Wilt never fouled out in a single game. For context, MJ played 1,072 games and fouled out 11 times. Kareem played almost 1,600 games and also fouled out 11 times. This is really a testament to his not really brutish manner as a player. He wasn't really a Shaquille O'Neal type player that dominated you by dunking every time and knocking you down and really using his physical muscle to knock people over. He was kind of a suave player. He kind of had that finesse and was able to keep it under control with his fouls.
The finger roll and the fadeaway were the biggest parts of his game.
Absolutely. But just Wilt being able to play over 1,000 games and never foul out, that is something that's never been done by any other players, to play that long.
And he was playing the whole game, too. He was always playing the whole game.
Yeah, playing overtime, playing 48 minutes a game, to never foul out is incredible odds. Now, obviously, you can't talk about Wilt Chamberlain without talking about March 2nd, 1962, where Wilt Chamberlain scored the most points in a single game with 100 points. Played against the New York Knicks in Hershey, Pennsylvania. For some reason, that game was in Hershey, Pennsylvania. He scored 100 points. Remember, at this time, there was no three-point line. So scoring 100 points without a three-point line, pretty unbelievable. During this game, he took 63 field goal attempts, which behind Wilt Chamberlain, Kobe Bryant has shot the ball 50 times in his last game of his career. That is the most attempts taken by a single player behind Wilt Chamberlain. He also shot 32 free throws. Absurd to think about.
He also probably missed a ton of those free throws, too, because he was a terrible free throw shooter.
Yeah, Wilt was known for being terrible at free throws. So, I mean, if he made all of these, I mean, obviously, if he just took 63 field goals and 32 shots, he could have had 150 points, but, whatever. But the funniest thing about this 100-point game is Where is the footage of this?
There's no footage.
There's no footage. You can see footage of Wilt Chamberlain long jumping, triple jumping. You can see footage of us walking around on the moon. You can see footage of first football games, of Red Grange playing football. Nobody was filming this 100-point game against the Knicks. What's going on there?
There is a radio broadcast of it that you can listen to. So there is documentation that this actually did occur. I don't think that this is a NBA ploy to convince us that somebody did score 100 points. But yeah, there's no footage of this event happening.
Okay. So those are the main records that we talk about with Wilt Chamberlain. That's kind of the things those are the stats that you hear about Wilt that, honestly, when you think about them too long, they kind of make you
go numb.
Yeah, you go numb hearing them. Like, when you hear 27 rebounds per game, when you think about it too much, it's unbelievable when you start to dig into these stats a little bit more. And when you list them off too many times, you don't really appreciate all of the numbers. But Wilt, obviously dominant on the court, so dominant, in fact, that the NBA had to mold the game around Wilt Chamberlain because we had never seen a player of his nature before. As Connor hit on, I believe, talking a little bit about how the game changed for Wilt in college, in 1958, the NBA had to make offensive goaltending illegal. Defensive goaltending was still illegal, but now offensive goaltending was illegal because there's a lot of clips of people shooting layups and Wilt just tapping the ball in. Couldn't do that anymore. In 1960, the NBA forced banning free throw dunks because Wilt was able, as we said before, jump behind the free throw line just dunk it, which is awesome. In 1964, the NBA widened the lane. Connor hit on how we got to 12 feet, but they then had to lengthen the paint even more from 12 feet to 16 feet to accommodate the likes of Wilt Chamberlain and Bill Russell, which leads us right into the synonymous partner of Wilt Chamberlain throughout his whole career is Bill Russell, who played, as we said, Wilt played from 56 to 73. Bill Russell played from 1956 to 1969. So these guys had a huge overlap in their careers. And whenever you talk about Wilt Chamberlain, you're always going to talk about Bill Russell and what Bill Russell was able to do that Wilt couldn't, and what Wilt could do that Bill couldn't do. Throughout Wilt's entire career, he would play Bill Russell 8 times in the playoffs, and Bill Russell would win 7 of the 8 series with his Boston Celtics, which is a huge talking point for the Wilt Chamberlain legacy, is his inability to win the big games. Bill Russell and those Celtics would be able to win 11 NBA championships, including 8 in a row. Isn't that absurd, winning 8 in a row? Now, granted, at the time when he was winning, at least at the start of the championships, there are only 8 teams in the league. So certainly not.
Having a quarter of the amount of teams is definitely different.
Yeah, certainly different. But still, winning 8 championships in a row is insane. And when you break down the numbers of Bill Russell between Bill Russell and Wilt, when you get more into the specifics, you really see that Bill Russell was more of a leader, was less of a individual player, was less talented individually. If they were to play each other in a one-on-one matchup, Wilt Chamberlain undoubtedly would win. But in a team setting, Bill Russell's style of play led to more wins. In their 94 matchups in the regular season, Bill Russell won 57 to Wilt's 37. And in the playoffs, Russell won 29 games out of Wilt's 20 games. So because Bill Russell was more of a selfless player and able to get the team more involved, that often led to more success for his teams. While Wilt, who was such a prolific scorer and had more of an individual game, that seemed to be to the detriment of his team success.
Yeah, I think the 2 championships that he's won came when they had the most offensive efficiency, which came off the back of him shooting less shots per game. Yeah, so Wilt could have learned there's no I in team. There is an I in Wilt, and there is an M-E in team, but there's no Wilt in team. How about that?
It's pretty good. So we're going to open this up to a conversation between Connor and I, a little less serious conversation about the debate over the era that Wilt Chamberlain played in. Because when you hear these stats, And when you hear someone bring up the conversation of Wilt Chamberlain being the best player of all time because of the records he has, the points he scored, undoubtedly someone's going to bring up the era and the competition that he played against.
Look, I've seen the clips too. I've seen the clips of him playing. I know what this looks like.
Yeah. And you can listen to as many old people that you want that are going to tell you he played against the same level of competition, they were just as aggressive. They were more physical than they are nowadays.
They would have gotten killed if they played back then.
Yeah, Curry would never have a chance back then. But when you look at the footage, I don't know. It's hard to deny. But before we get into that, there are some concrete stats that we could look at to see how the eras compare. And at least from a physical standpoint, the average height of NBA players at that time was not much different than nowadays. The average height for a player was about 6'6", where nowadays it's closer to 6'7", and the average height for a center was around 6'9". Nowadays it's 6'9", 6'10". So it wasn't like Wilt was towering over every single player when he played. He was playing against people moderately the same height as him. People would also like to point to other players that were much taller than Wilt Chamberlain, like Yao Ming or Taco Fall, who are well over 7 feet and were not able to replicate the same number of stats.
Taco Fall is irrelevant.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, the next argument people like to point at was Bill Russell was his only competition.
He was playing against plumbers and firemen.
Yeah, that's all he was playing against. People like to say that Wilt wasn't actually playing anybody. He was playing plumbers and firemen, and Bill Russell was his only real competition. But actually, if you look at the stats, in the 29 postseason series that Wilt played in, 19 of them he actually played against a Hall of Fame center. Now, granted, 8 of those were Bill Russell, but he also played against Nate Thurmond, Willis Reed, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Walt Bellamy, and Jerry Lucas. So, certainly played against good competition in the playoffs, which ironically is where Wilt seemed to struggle the most, was those big games. Connor, you want to talk a little bit about how the game has changed, that theory?
Yeah, so I think for me, the biggest argument that holds weight is that the way that basketball was played back then and the way that basketball is played now has changed a lot. I think what is the biggest difference is the pace of play that creates these disparities in the numbers that Wilt would have. So the era that he played in was one of the highest paces of play that existed in NBA history. So it's even faster than it was today. So teams would regularly average 110 and 120 possessions per game, whereas now it's closer to 95 or 100 possessions per game. And the main reason for this was just that teams just weren't as good and strategies weren't as refined. So teams would be taking shots far earlier into possessions, and people would just be missing more shots. If people were less skills, it's easy to think that there would be more shots going off the rim, hence creating more rebounds and opportunities for Wilt to rebound and score. So when you look at Wilt Chamberlain and Bill Russell holding the 2 highest rebounding records, it makes sense when the teams were taking the most shots that they were in the NBA and probably missing the most that they were in the NBA. So undoubtedly, the game was different, which created a catalyst for a athletic freak like Wilt Chamberlain to take advantage. So you can't deny that the eras weren't different than they were today. But I do think it's unfair to say that, LeBron could come down in the 60s and dominate, or Kobe Bryant or Michael Jordan, which I would never say that they couldn't, right? If you put Curry or LeBron or Michael Jordan, Kobe in the 60s, it'd be like Icarus bringing people fire, right? But I think it's not fair to say that Wilt Chamberlain couldn't come to the current NBA with current technologies, current training regimens. As we said before, the man was drinking 7-Up during his games. He didn't even go to bed before his 100-point game. He didn't even sleep beforehand. I think if there was different focuses and different training regimens, there's no saying that Wilt Chamberlain couldn't have been as prolific of a player in the NBA today. So I think that in general, it's just very difficult to compare eras. It's a waste of time comparing eras. You're not going to be able to get to the end of it. I think what's important is that Wilt Chamberlain was able to accomplish these stats in the era that he played, and in isolation, his career was incredible.
And it's also, when you're comparing the eras, I think it is inevitably slightly disrespectful to the older players themselves. Like, you could say if you put LeBron in Wilt's era, he would dominate, But I would argue if LeBron's figure was born when Wilt Chamberlain was born and the basketball game itself was where it was when Wilt was born, he would not be able to score like 100 points per game. Like LeBron James and Kobe and MJ are obviously so dominant nowadays because of the evolution the game has taken over the gap between Wilt Chamberlain and LeBron. The game has evolved so much. Strategies have become so much better. People have figured out what works and what doesn't, and actual player development has grown so much. But if LeBron started playing when basketball was invented, right? I mean, I don't think it ignores the progress that all of the players had to make before players like LeBron, all of the people that had to come before them before we could have a player that is so masterful at every aspect of the game. Does that make sense? Does that make sense?
I think so. You're saying if LeBron started at the same point as Will and was brought up?
Yeah, and like LeBron didn't have the knowledge of a modern NBA player. If he had the mindset of a player in Wilt Chamberlain, sure, he would have been fantastic, but he probably would have been similar to the other players we see right now. But people are talking about picking LeBron up and placing him with all of his knowledge nowadays in that old era. Obviously, he would dominate.
He probably wouldn't even be a basketball player. He'd probably
Exactly.
leverage money, his knowledge of the future, to become a stockbroker and make infinite amounts of money.
Obviously, very hard to compare eras, but it's kind of a weird argument because you wouldn't have LeBron without all of these players like Bill Russell, like Wilt Chamberlain. You wouldn't be where it is now if we weren't having people shooting 120 shots a game and figuring out, okay, maybe we need to hold the ball for a look. There's something else here. We should hold the ball longer. Yeah, it is funny. So that's going to lead us to the end of Wilt's NBA career, which is going to lead us into the post-NBA career, where some of the personality of Wilt Chamberlain starts to come out a little bit more, and some of the funnier stories start to emerge. But real quick, the story of him actually retiring from the NBA, I think is worth mentioning. Wilt, after winning a championship with the Lakers in the 71-72 season, he wanted to renegotiate his contract with the Lakers. The Lakers waited until September of 1972 to actually respond to Wilt. Obviously, back then, communication was very difficult, was harder than it is nowadays. You had a lot of mail.
Yeah, no phones.
No phones, right?
No Snapchat.
So he was frustrated with this and chose to leave the Lakers and sign a contract with the San Diego Conquistadors.
Never heard of them.
Yeah, who were part of the ABA, which was an NBA rival league. He signed a contract worth, I believe, $600,000, which is around $4 million a year, which pre-NBA, like pre-big NBA salary.
That's what Eberflus is making.
It's pretty sweet. Where he would serve as both a player and a coach. Unfortunately, the Lakers sued Chamberlain due to some contract negotiations. Apparently, back then, if you didn't return the contract that the Lakers sent you by mail signed, the Lakers would interpret that as you want to renew your contract with the Lakers. So Wilt Chamberlain was under 2-year contract in 71, 72, and 72, 73. When the Lakers sent him the contract in July of 73, Chamberlain never signed it, supposedly never signed it or mailed it back. So he was under contract for the 73-74 season where he was supposed to be playing for the Conquistadors. A judge ruled that Chamberlain, because he was still under contract with the Lakers, couldn't play for any team other than the Lakers. So Chamberlain decided to coach for the Conquistadors, which he seemed unenthused by and actually left most of the coaching up to his assistant. Conquistadors unfortunately finished 37-47 in the regular season and would end up losing to the Utah Stars in the playoffs. And this would be his kind of anticlimactic retirement from professional basketball.
You don't hear a lot about the San Diego Conquistadors these days, so I think this was a short-lived time for the Conquistadors.
So one of the first things Wilt did following his retirement from professional basketball was getting involved in professional volleyball. During his time with the Lakers, he started to become kind of a hobby volleyball player. and he eventually became a board member for the newly founded and short-lived International Volleyball Association in 1974. Wilt quickly moved up the ranks, and in 1975, he became the IVA's president. He just started running the whole thing.
Usually a bad sign for an organization, quick movement, but...
Yeah, so he started running the whole ship in 1975 and was an integral part for IVA games actually getting broadcasted and drawing viewers. So much so that the IVA actually inducted Wilt Chamberlain into the Volleyball Hall of Fame, cementing Wilt as one of the few athletes that is enshrined in the Hall of Fame for multiple sports. It's pretty funny. There is actually footage of Wilt Chamberlain playing volleyball, and
How's he look?
Looks fantastic. There were rumors of Wilt Chamberlain spiking the ball, and when he would spike it, his waist would be at the net because he would be able to jump so high. I mean, another example.
I couldn't imagine him playing volleyball.
Yeah, just absurd. Outside of volleyball, Wilt was also involved in track and field. He started an athletic club called Wilt's Athletic Club, where he hosted several notable athletes, including a couple future gold medalists, including Andre Phillips, Alice Brown, and Giante Bolden. Wilt also, throughout his post-NBA career, was always flirting with the idea of coming back to professional basketball. As he left the NBA and the NBA started to get more and more popular, contracts got bigger and bigger and bigger, and I think he started to feel a little bit slighted that he was not able to reap the rewards of being such a great player. And he was always flirting with the idea of coming back in the 80s. He actually planned to return to the NBA in the 80s. Coach Larry Brown claimed the Cleveland Cavaliers actually offered Wilt a contract to come back and play. And even when he was over 50 years old, the Nets offered him a contract.
It's an unserious organization.
To play.
It's an unserious organization.
But Wilt unfortunately declined, which kind of makes you think Wilt did a lot of talking about modern NBA players and how he would do, but was given the option twice and never decided to come back. So outside of basketball, Wilt, as we'll talk about a little bit later, was a very charismatic person, quite a big
time
personality outside of the NBA, and was very interested in pursuing a career in acting. So in 1976, Wilt actually started a film production company and distribution company to make his first film called Go For It. Now, you cannot
This is actually a good movie. I've seen
you
it.
cannot
I've seen it a
find
couple
a
times.
lot of information on Go For It, except you can watch the whole movie on Tubi for free. I almost started watching it.
I had to pull you away from watching the whole
I
thing.
mean,
You
I
were
was
just so
glued
invested.
to that screen. From what I gathered, there's no synopsis you can find on IMDb, but a reviewer made it sound like it was a sports movie that featured both skateboarding and surfing.
Wow.
One reviewer wrote that it featured fantastic footage from the Hang 10 American Pro Surfing Championship and the Women's International Surfing Championship. So, imagination runs.
That reviewer, Christopher Nolan.
The imagination runs wild with possibilities of what this movie could be about. Chamberlain also famously played a large role in Conan the Destroyer, the 1984 film, where he was introduced to Arnold Schwarzenegger.
The Governator.
Yes, this is his only credited film role, but leads to a lot of funny Wilt stories about Arnold and Wilt lifting weights together. Wilt, outside of, other than his acting career, he lived a very lavish life in Los Angeles. Chamberlain famously also had a $1 million house in Bel Air that he nicknamed Ursa Major, I guess after his nickname, the Big Dipper.
The Big Dipper.
This house was designed according to Chamberlain's exact specifications. So some of these specifications included having no right angles in the house.
Hated him.
So looking up the house, there's a lot of angles in there, but I guess none of them are those perfect 90 degrees.
It looks like a spaceship.
A lot of obtuse and acute angles in there. He also had a non-PG, he had an X-rated room with apparently mirrored walls and a fur-covered waterbed.
That's a shout out for waterbeds. You know, they don't get a lot of play these days, but put some fur on there. I don't know. Like Freak Flag Fly.
Yeah. Chamberlain also apparently lived alone with 2 cats named Zip and Zap and several Great Danes. Connor, do you want to talk about Wilt's love life?
Yeah, sure. So moving on, I think the thing that is just as synonymous or maybe slightly less synonymous with Wilt Chamberlain's name is his love life. When he was 55, Wilt Chamberlain published a book called A View from Above, because he's such a tall guy. 3.5 on Goodreads if you're interested. Wilt Chamberlain, in a throwaway line, claimed that he slept with 20,000 women. Now that is a lot of women. Now, this number was indeed an extrapolation from one of his friends from a 10-day vacation that the two of them took together in Hawaii, where the friend would mark down on his notebook. He would take a check mark every time that Wilt Chamberlain took a nice lady into bed with him.
It's a weird friend. A weird thing.
A very weird thing, and I wonder if the friend maybe was jealous, wasn't having a whole lot going on for him, but he said in a 10-day span, he had 23 check marks at the end of the day. So he, I believe, halved that number, did a little more, and essentially multiplied that by like 40 years, and that's how he arrived at 20,000. So he would need to have had sex for 37 years with 1.5 women, which is certainly a lot of people. But on a Conan interview, he said that one of the lessons he learned was something that's better than having 1,000 women is having one woman 1,000 different times, which again was kind of like a "hey, look at me" throwaway line from Wilt Chamberlain, but the man was certainly charismatic,
certainly promiscuous. He later clarified the statement, saying he was surprised with how fixated people were on the number, and he said he was using the number more.
That's hilarious. He was confused by people who were fixated.
He was saying it more as a testament to how much of a part of his life his relationships with women was in relationship to his relationship with basketball. There was like a 50-50% part of his life.
He needed to explain so concretely how much sex he was having.
Unbelievable. Also, to justify why he was single, I guess he wanted to say, hey guys, I'm doing pretty good for myself. You don't need to tie me down.
I think that 20,000 number has become well associated with Wilt Chamberlain. The man who slept with 20,000 women, that's something you can't look away from for Wilt Chamberlain.
Hey, and you watch any interview with him, he's a very fun guy.
He's got riz.
Got a lot of personality. That's what I'll say. So that will lead us to the end of the Wilt Chamberlain conversation. Now we're going to hit you with a couple 15 fun Wilt facts. Connor, how about we alternate on them?
Sure.
Fact 1, his dad, only 5'7".
Fact 2, he once lifted a 600-pound box of letters and envelopes out of an elevator while visiting the Knicks after retiring.
Number 3, he reportedly had a 48 to 54-inch vertical leap.
Number 4, he beat NFL legend Jim Brown in a foot race not once, but twice.
He could reportedly dunk on a 12-foot rim.
In his mid-40s, he played Magic Johnson at UCLA in pickup. After Magic called a soft foul, Wilt declared, "There will be no more layups." And as the story goes, there weren't any layups. He blocked every one of Magic Johnson's shots.
7, Wilt blocked all 9 of Hall of Famer Walt Bellamy's shot attempts.
We mentioned him earlier.
In one half, then said, "Okay, Walter, now you can play."
He could bench press 550 pounds in college. Even at the age of 59, he could still bench 465 pounds.
Number 9, Wilt outperformed bodybuilders like Arnold Schwarzenegger doing tricep extensions with 150 to 170 pounds, while others could only manage 120 pounds.
Number 10, he signed a contract to fight Muhammad Ali, though the fight never happened.
11, Wilt could literally take the change off the top of a backboard.
Number 12, after scoring 32 points against Oklahoma in basketball, the next day he set a school high jump record, tying the Big 7 championship at 6 feet, 6 inches, and 3/4.
Number 13, Wilt once dislocated Gus Johnson's shoulder by blocking his shot so hard.
Number 14, Wilt Chamberlain dunked a ball so hard that it hit the ground and broke basketball player Johnny Kerr's toe.
And our final fact, number 15, another dunk sent the ball over a 15-foot fence, per Connie Hawkins.
if you spend 30 minutes, you could gather up another 30 or 40 ridiculous Wilt Chamberlain stories. He's definitely a player where the myth just grows larger and larger. And it was in the 60s and 70s. There's not a whole lot of fact-checking going on, but my opinion at the end of the day is it's more fun to just think that all of these things did happen and think that he is just this mythical creature that is Wilt Chamberlain.
So that'll do it for this episode of the Chicagolandians. This was one of our longer episodes covering Wilt Chamberlain. I think it speaks to the man that Wilt was.
It's a long episode for a long, large guy.
Absolutely. If you enjoyed this episode, why not leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you listen? And if you want to see more Chicagolandians content, you can find us on all social media platforms, including YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter at the Chicagolandians. And as always, we'll say, bear down.
Bear down. Woo.